And the popularity of net neutrality draws cross-partisan support on the Hill, but like most proposed bills from either party, the devil is in the details. Here to shed some light on the latest telecom hot topics, including net neutrality, cybersecurity, privacy, and immigration reform, are Alina Selyukh, a tech and telecom policy reporter for Reuters, and Kate Tummarello, who covers tech for Politico Pro. And I hope I got both of your names right as far as pronunciation. Thank you. Of course, we're talking about a number of topics today, but we're going to lead by talking about net neutrality, just because it's timely and relevant. Of course, we all know at this point that both Republicans and Democrats intend to have support for net neutrality. We're not exactly sure what definition each one of them has at this point, but in a lot of senses, it's supposed to prohibit data throttling, blocking, or prohibit blocking as well, and also internet fast lanes. There's skepticism on both sides and skepticism from consumers as well, sort of mainstream consumers. I came across a quote by, now I get his name wrong, Hamza Shaban of The Verge, and I want to read that first before I come back to you guys and get you to comment on that. The quote is this: "Even if the bill represents an earnest compromise, it still doesn't come close to what the internet activists and Democrats are asking for by avoiding a reclassification of broadband and working to render the FCC impotent. The new Republican Congress suggests it doesn't really want net neutrality, it just wants to look like it does." Kate, I'm going to start with you. Can you sort of read the tea leaves for us on that?
Sure. So at this point in the debate, everyone says they're for a free and open internet, and the question is really, how do we get there? The Republican bill, which came out last week, would reinstate and even really boost the FCC's old net neutrality rules, but it would do so by keeping the FCC from going ahead with FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler's plan to reclassify broadband as a Title II service. And that is not sitting well with Democrats. We saw in hearings this week every Democrat really coming out against the bill, saying, you can say you want net neutrality, but you can't do it by putting these limits on the FCC. The FCC needs to be agile, it needs to be able to respond to changing technologies, and if you limit its authority, it'll be stuck in kind of the very specific limits of the bill. So we have this partisan fight happening over what, at this point sounds like it should be easy. Everyone's for net neutrality. The question really is, what does net neutrality mean and what are the specifics? And Republicans say they're willing to compromise. They're open to negotiation. They want to talk to Democrats, but there's really no leverage here because next month, Wheeler is expected to go ahead with his plans to reclassify, and why should the Democrats come to the table when they're going to get what they want in a matter of weeks?
And it's very important to know that at this point it is pretty much a waiting game. It seemed like there was a possibility that some Democrats were going to come out in support of this Republican bill, or at least there were really intense negotiations in order to create this bipartisan support for the Republican bill. It didn't happen, and in the hearings this week we clearly heard the kind of key Democrats who we were watching indicate that they had no interest in rushing into negotiations and trying to get some kind of legislation actually formally proposed before the vote by the FCC. But it's also important to note, I think, just how much of a departure this bill represents for the Republican Party. I mean, we went from the most common line was net neutrality rules are a solution in search of a problem. There was no interest in kind of engaging this conversation from what we could tell throughout the entire year. And from the beginning of the year, just the fact of the FCC coming up on this vote and presumably following the tracks that Obama had laid out kind of presents the urgency for the Republicans to come up with a plan that gets them so much further on their net neutrality position towards the net neutrality advocates' positions, but just short of what President Obama had actually suggested the FCC do.
Now, of course, the Republican net neutrality draft bill just came out recently, as I think one of you mentioned before. What specifically, if you know, is in the draft bill that the Democrats would be opposed to? And Kate, I'll start with you.
So it's not really the specifics of the net neutrality protections that Democrats are upset about. It, like Alina said, it gives them everything they want. What it is the limits on the FCC authority. So the bill would keep the FCC from reclassifying under Title II, which is Wheeler's plan, but it would go a step further and keep the FCC from regulating broadband under Section 706 of the Telecommunications Act, which is the provision of the law that a lot of people expect the FCC to use to do non-net neutrality related things like municipal broadband. If they want to go ahead and preempt state laws and let local governments create their own internet networks, they're going to rely on Section 706 most likely. So if the bill goes forward, that would, in theory, if it were signed into law, keep the FCC from using that section 706 of the law, and that's a big sticking point for Democrats. They view Section 706 as the catch-all. If it can't be done through another part of the law, then it can be done through Section 706 if it's related to the internet. So things like changing the way the Universal Service Fund works, that would be through 706 most likely. And if the bill goes forward, they kind of lose that big catch-all piece.
I would say that, in a very broad brushstroke, the main issues with this bill are that it's both narrow and broad at the same time. When you look at it, it's just a couple of pages, or whatever, 3 pages.
7 pages,
It's very short. And so there were a lot of, when you get into the nitty-gritty of what's actually in the bill, there are a lot of concerns about some things not being defined or leaving potential loopholes. There is a conversation about reasonable network management and what exactly does that represent. Specialized access, what exactly does that represent? But as Kate pointed out, one of the key sticking points is the definition of the authority of the FCC, in that the bill seeks to really restrict the FCC to sort of an enforcer on a case-by-case basis. So the FCC, in a broad sense, would sort of be limited to adjudicating particular complaints, and would be really restricted in future attempts to somehow regulate or adapt the net neutrality rules or regulate the deployment of broadband, as Kate was talking about.
Alina, is it possible that, and that there's some banter online about this, that the White House and both parties may not have a firm grasp on what it takes to create these laws, these net neutrality laws by the FCC? In other words, that's the FCC's perspective of people don't really understand what's involved in creating these laws. So it's very easy to make kind of general, broad brush comments about which direction we should go in, but the FCC and Wheeler have to do the hard work.
Well, it's really hard to understate the complexity of this issue. We've been tackling this for going on a year, and it every time is a bit of a struggle to explain it to the folks out there, kind of your regular reader, what all goes in here. And I think it is a really complicated task that is facing the FCC, but ultimately the FCC's statute is written by Congress, and both President Obama and Chairman Wheeler have in the past said that they didn't object to Congress trying to step in and set the rules of the road, if they so desire, going forward, so that this issue doesn't come up over and over again. But at this point in time, it seems pretty clear that neither the FCC nor the White House is really interested in Republicans trying to preempt the FCC's process. So my assumption is that we're heading toward the FCC setting the rules in February, which will immediately go to the courts, which is where we're going to see if there's a stay or if there's no stay, and then we get into the nitty-gritty discussion in Congress, which we haven't quite gotten to that point of detail on the legislative aspect of it quite yet.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's a good segue into the next question. Of course, you mentioned on February 26th, the FCC will be making their rulemaking on net neutrality, but in between now and then, this is for our viewers that maybe not be as astute as you guys are in this. For their information, what's going to happen between now and February 20? What could happen between now and February 26? Kate?
Well, on February 5th, Wheeler has to circulate his proposal to the rest of the commissioners, so we'll probably start getting hints and whispers of what that includes, and we'll get a better sense of exactly, what his plan is, because he wants to reclassify at this point, but he's also talked a lot about forbearing and kind of what parts of the law the FCC can go without enforcing, so that Title II regulation isn't as overbearing as a lot of ISPs are worried it will be. So we'll start to see kind of the specifics of his plans trickle out as the commission reviews it. And we'll see a lot of talk from Republicans. It seems like the authors of this bill are still really hopeful the FCC will hold off on their vote. That seems entirely unlikely, but Republicans will certainly keep calling for it in the lead up to the FCC vote.
I think that's what we'll see. And once February 5th hits, which is not that far away, much of the conversation will be about the specifics of the bill. There was a call also from Republicans on the Senate and the House side to be more transparent about the FCC's process. So if the FCC follows their direction and decides to make the proposed wording of the new rules available to the public on February 5th, there will be plenty to dissect until then. From the political standpoint, however, I don't think we'll see very much of an effort to try to set some kind of legislative agenda or to preempt the FCC's, as I was saying earlier, the FCC's vote with some kind of legislation. I just don't see Senator Nelson and Representative Pallone quite being willing to sign on to some kind of legislation until they see what the FCC really does.
Alina, I want to move to cybersecurity. I know this is sort of your wheelhouse, and I want to get your
Just one part of it.
Just
a little part of it.
Okay, good. I want to get your input on the White House recently dropping their cyber info sharing legislative proposal, and what that entails or could entail, and whether, and I'm talking in the midst of the Sony hack incident, whether any cyber bill by the president or by the White House will prevent even a novice hacker from doing what they do and being successful.
Well, speaking of another completely complicated and unwieldy topic, it's a very multifaceted issue, both in Congress and for the companies to tackle with. And cyber legislation has been attempted in Congress several times. In particular, the information sharing has become the sort of focal point, I would say, from a legislative purpose, for legislative purposes. Both the companies and the government all agree that this is something they want and they need, particularly because when you talk to cybersecurity experts, many of them will say when it comes to a hacking attack, it's a lot less about trying to prevent some hackers to get into your networks, because presumably they're already there. And it's a lot more about mitigating the damage they can do and detecting them soon enough in order to do so. And a lot of the experts will say that being able to share information in real time with the government, and particularly the sort of the intelligence about the threats, is what they need to be fast in attributing the attack, to be fast in detecting it, to be fast in knowing how to sort of tackle it in the fallout. And so the cybersecurity legislation that the White House has proposed is similar to what they had proposed in the past. It is similar to legislation that has been on the Hill. And that's kind of one area that there has been progress, and there is a possibility that that there will be movement on the Hill, if not this year, then soon enough.
Now, the CISPA bill has been on deck for quite some time. There's, again, some skeptics out there that say, do we really need information sharing? So to that effect of what you just mentioned, is information sharing a benefit?
I would say yes. There are a lot of questions about how do you accomplish that, sort of similar to net neutrality. Everybody agrees we need to better share information, and that there needs to be some sort of proper framework approved by Congress as to how the government and the companies interact when it comes to a cybersecurity attack. That has never happened before. Right now it kind of happens on a haphazard level. A lot of cybersecurity folks will say that they work with the government officials just kind of on a peer level, like if you know someone at the FBI, you'll call them up and seek their advice. So it needs to be codified, and so presumably that's where we're heading. The question is, how do you get there? And this is where CISPA's skeptics come into play. There were so many issues with CISPA, including, or particularly, the efforts to sort of settle the debate over the privacy protections as well as the liabilities, the liability protections that it would afford to the companies. There was never kind of a proper agreement reached in order for that bill to pass the Senate. The White House has threatened veto, and in fact, this year already, the White House officials, in announcing and kind of revealing their own cybersecurity efforts, they indicated that they weren't necessarily interested in trying to tack on kind of new stuff to CISPA. They were like, let's put CISPA aside and move on with some kind of new legislation. And so what they propose is similar to CISPA, but it's an adapted version. It tries to eliminate a lot of the sticking points that CISPA had on privacy and the liabilities.
Kate, just to stay on cyber just for an extra moment, and move away from industry and government just for a second and talk about the average citizen, the average consumer. Should they be worried about their private information being transferred to law enforcement per se?
That is definitely a concern, and that was part of the cybersecurity debate. I think in the wake of the surveillance debate of last year, the last couple of years, we've seen the leaks from Edward Snowden. We've seen a lot of talk about making sure government doesn't have too much access or has to go through the appropriate court system to get access to data. And that's definitely a big part of the concerns with cybersecurity information sharing, is if certain government agencies have to get a company's data to make sure that it can mitigate a cyber attack, what's it going to do with that data next? So that'll be a big piece of what we talk about going forward.
Immigration reform, Kate, I want to ask you a couple questions about that and what we can look forward to in 2015. And I also want you to just give a little bit of background to our viewers once again as to how immigration in the technology space was looked over before. Can you give us some background on that?
Sure. So, the tech industry has been asking for an increased ability to hire high-skilled foreign talent for a while now, but it has not yet achieved that goal. We've seen, this is one issue that has a lot of bipartisan support. If you ask Republicans, they definitely want their American tech companies to be able to hire more people. And if you ask Democrats, they feel the same way. The question is, will the high-skilled immigration reform debate get kind of bogged down by the broader immigration reform debate? And that's a very contentious partisan issue. So in November, President Obama announced a series of executive actions aimed at improving the immigration system. And he had a few small items for the tech industry kind of thrown in there, a little bit of help, but not what the tech industry was looking for at all. So this year, we'll certainly see the industry push a lot of its initiatives going forward. We've already seen some bills introduced. We've seen some pledges to introduce bills. This will continue to be a topic of discussion. It's just really a question of, can Democrats get behind a bill that only addresses a small piece of the immigration system's problems? And if they do get behind that bill, will Republicans walk away and say, well, we did something. We're ready to head into the 2016 campaign having accomplished an immigration reform issue. And I think a lot of Democrats are hesitant to kind of sign up for that debate if that's the end of the debate. They want a lot bigger reforms to get accomplished. So this has kind of become a chess piece here. Immigration reform could get done, I think high-skilled immigration reform could get done tomorrow if there was kind of the push for it, but no one wants to give up that leverage yet, since there's a much broader debate happening here.
If we can drill down a little bit, the Immigration Innovation Act, and I apologize if you had already sort of alluded to that before, but if you didn't, can you tell us a bit about that and how the cap works with the H-1B visas?
Sure. So currently there's a cap on H-1B visas, which is the visas that tech companies use to hire high-skilled employees from abroad. And that cap sits at 65,000, and then there are another 20,000 for people with advanced degrees. And for years, companies have been saying that's just not high enough. We have plenty of engineering jobs that we just can't fill. We can't fill with American citizens. We can't fill within these caps. We need higher caps. This is something that Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg has pushed, especially. He's kind of led the tech industry on this front in the last couple of years. So a bunch of the high-skilled immigration bills, including Senator Hatch's, would bump up that cap significantly. And that's something that, there are some opponents to that in Congress. Jeff Sessions, for instance, is very opposed to this because of the concerns that it'd be taking jobs away from American citizens. But the tech companies respond and say, we would hire anyone. We're not looking for, we're not looking to bring people in from other countries. We just have to, because the American job pool just we just can't fill these jobs with people here.
Now, did you also mention the Startup Act as far as creating a new category for visas?
So that's part of, Obama tried to get at that issue a little bit with his executive actions, and I think we're going to see just a bunch of piecemeal high-skilled immigration reform bills introduced, but until there's kind of a coherent approach that both parties can get behind, it's really unclear if anything can move anytime soon.
Well, we don't like to elongate, if that's a proper word, these discussions. We like to try to keep it succinct. We talked about cybersecurity, privacy, immigration, net neutrality. If I'm missing something, I might be. So we appreciate both of you coming into the studio. We know you have to get back to work, not too far, I hope, down in Arlington somewhere.
Thanks
but
very
we
much.
appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.